Welcome back to our Trails as Parks Video Bite series. I'm Erica, a naturalist with Trails as Parks, and I'm happy to have you join us today as we chat about our Wriggly Wonders, earthworms. If you've ever taken a walk outside after it's been raining, you're likely to have seen worms crawling on the pavement. Or maybe you like to fish and you use worms as bait. Let's explore all the other reasons why we should pay closer attention to our earth diving friends. Most worms we see are reddish brown and a few inches long. As young worms, they are smooth and uniformly shaped. As they grow, they develop a lighter colored band near the front of their bodies called a clitellum. This is part of the reproductive system and produces eggs. Towards the back of the worm, there can be a flat, arrow shape that is used to help dig. This also shows us which side is the front or ventral side and the back or dorsal side of the worm. Have you ever heard that when you cut a worm in half, both halves will grow into separate worms? This is only half true. If a worm is cut in half behind the clitellum, only the half with the head will survive, and it takes about 2 weeks to regenerate the rest of its body. But if a worm is cut in half before the clitellum, both halves of the worm will die. What good are worms anyway? They are a gardener's best helpers. Most gardeners have a compost pile where food scraps and lawn clippings are mixed together and broken down into a rich fertilizer. This process can take a long time, anywhere from a few months to over a year. Worms help not only speed up the process, but as they consume the food scraps, castings, or their little worm poop, are left behind. The castings contain a higher level of nutrients than if the food scraps had been composted without worms. Worms are powerful fertilizer factories. Using worms for this process is called vermicompost, and raising worms for this purpose is called vermiculture. Trails as Parks has started our own vermiculture for the community garden at Dennis Johnson Park. We have a small, layered habitat box for our worms to live in and vermicompost. The top layer consists of a damp substrate of grass, shredded paper, kale, squash, coffee grounds, and other worm-friendly scraps. The worms come up from the underlayers to feed as needed. The second layer is a thick layer of castings. This is the goal of vermicomposting, to create this rich fertilizer. This layer drains into the bottom, which contains damp castings and liquid called leachate. When diluted with water, it can be used in addition to castings to fertilize plants. We love our worms. Not only do they help us in the garden, but also supply us with plenty of bait for fishing. Where do earthworms come from? In North America, almost all the native worms died out in the last ice age, which means the plants and other life here adapted to life without earthworms. However, starting in the 1600s, early settlers from Europe unknowingly brought other species of worms with them on ships, and the invading worms quickly took over. We're left today with exotic species like nightcrawlers and red wigglers. What's the harm in non-native worms? While the worms are a great help to gardeners, they can have a negative impact on our forests. By nature, worms stir up the soil and make the nutrients there more accessible to plants. This is highly desirable in gardens, but extremely disruptive to wild habitats. Native plants already know how to extract nutrients without the help of worms, which means the nutrients made available by the worms are now made available to undesirable invasive species of plants that can take over our forests. Plus, earthworms are not just confined to our forested areas either. They can also till up soils in cities and subdivisions, speeding up erosion and damaging our valuable infrastructure. For their small size, worms are truly powerful. They can dig deep underground and move quickly on the surface. Let's take a closer look at how a worm functions by dissecting a preserved specimen.
For this dissection, you will need a Carolina's Perfect Solution earthworm, an earthworm dissection mat, a dissecting pan, dissecting scissors, forceps, dissecting pins, safety glasses, gloves, and a lab apron. After putting on your PPE, let's begin with a look at external structures. Identify the anterior and posterior end of the earthworm. Notice the anterior end is slightly larger than the posterior end. At the anterior end, locate the mouth and prostomium. At the opposite posterior end, locate the anus. Also notice that the dorsal or top surface of the earthworm is slightly darker than the ventral surface of the earthworm. Now, notice the segments on the earthworm. The earthworm's body is made up of over 100 segments. The enlarged structure beginning at segment 31 is the clitellum. This structure is vital to external fertilization in earthworms. Let's move on to the internal anatomy of the earthworm. Place the earthworm in the dissecting pan, ventral side down. Gently pierce the dorsal wall with the scissors, just posterior to the clitellum. Continue cutting the dorsal body wall until you reach the mouth. Pin the body wall to the pan. You may have to cut away the tissue between the segments to do this. These thin walls separating the segments are called septa. Identify the organs of the digestive system, including the pharynx, crop, gizzard, and intestine. The circulatory system consists of the 2 blood vessels and 5 pairs of aortic arches. Locate the dorsal blood vessel and the 5 aortic arches. To locate the ventral blood vessel, lift a portion of the intestine posterior to the gizzard. Running along the ventral body wall below the intestine is the ventral nerve cord, a part of the nervous system. At the anterior end of the earthworm, locate the pair of cerebral ganglia, which functions as the earthworm's brain. The ventral nerve cord extends from these ganglia down the body of the earthworm. Locate the excretory organs called nephridia in each segment. These specialized structures remove nitrogenous waste from the earthworm's body. Earthworm dissection is an ideal activity to introduce students to structure and function and basic dissection procedures.
Earthworms are organisms that are easy to overlook, but that doesn't mean that they should be ignored. Next time you see a worm, recall the things that we shared in this video and ponder the daily rituals of the curious, wriggling creatures found underfoot. Thanks for watching. I'm Erica with Trails as Parks, and we'll see you next time.